2013. Thanks for coming. A special welcome to Professor Andrew Mack. He's the director of the Human Security Report Project at the Simon Fraser University, and he's the editor-in-chief of this report. My name is Adrian from the Swiss Mission. Switzerland is looking back to several years of good cooperation with the Human Security Report Project. We've been co-financing also this study, and we're happy to be able to host this launch today. I think Professor Mack is bringing us good news. The title is promising. The decline in global violence. I mean, there's a question mark somewhere I've seen, but still, this is a bit counterintuitive at the moment. If you read the newspapers, you read of a lot of conflicts: Syria, Central African Republic, and newly now, of course, the sad story in the Ukraine. But all the more reassuring if the scientists are giving us some hope that the world, in the end, is on the right track. I think also you're going to mention the work of the UN. I think you're calling it inefficient, but still effective. So it's a qualified assessment, but we still take it as a motivation to keep on our work. Professor Mack, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd just like to say a word of thanks to the Swiss Mission, who've been on the Swiss Foreign Ministry, who've actually been supporting us, I think, for probably about 8 years now. And as you know, you probably can imagine that getting funding for organizations like ours at a time when there's an economic crisis and defense budgets, aid budgets have been cut, is extremely difficult. So what our report is all about, basically, is that there is now today a pretty widespread consensus in the research community that political violence has declined dramatically since the end of World War II. There is much less agreement about the long-term trends. And when I say long-term trends, I'm thinking we're talking back here, going back thousands of years and not just 20 or even a few centuries. And much of this debate has been sparked by Steven Pinker, whose book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, I think has stimulated an extraordinary debate in the academic community, which is still going strong. Because of the slowness of academic publishing, a lot of the journal articles about Pinker's book are still coming out. Outside the research community, where there's actually much less agreement, and people don't, I think, still realize the extent to which violence has declined. And if we actually look at the recent statement by both Steven Pinker on the one hand and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the other, you can get some idea about how different the perspectives on where we are today are. And Steven Pinker's quotation has been repeated many, many times. We may be living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence. And then we have General Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, saying, today's world has become more dangerous than it has ever been. And they're obviously two very different perspectives, although it's possible to argue that Martin Dempsey was really talking about the future rather than about the present, but I think he was actually talking about both. So I thought I'd start off by just giving a few snapshots of what the data tell us. On the trend data, first of all on political violence and then on criminal violence. And almost all the data show that violence is in fact trending downwards. This is the data on international wars, and by international wars we're talking about interstate wars, and we're also talking about the wars of the struggles for liberation and control from colonial rule. And you can see if you look at the graphic that the red ones are the anti-colonial wars and the blue ones are the interstate wars. Put them together, you have international wars, and you can see that there has actually been an extraordinary decline from around 6 or more than 6 per year on average per decade to less than 1 today. So a huge decline in international wars. And this is important because international wars kill far more people on average than do civil wars. But if we look at the number of civil wars, and here we're looking at the high-intensive civil wars, that is to say, those that kill 1,000 or more people a year. And you can see that over this period of time, going from the left-hand side up to the peak, This is the Cold War, when the number of these wars increases many times over. And then at the end of the Cold War, you see this decline, which is around 60%, and again, pretty radical. And then finally, if we look at the decline in the number of war deaths, and this is looking at the number of reported battle deaths per million of the population of the world per year. And so you can see that in 1950, it was somewhere between 200 and 250 people dead per million of the world's population. And when you come down to 2005, it's less than 10. So again, an extraordinary decline there. And this isn't all, no matter really what sort of indicator you look at. We mentioned down here campaigns of deadly violence, genocides, military coups, death from terrorism. They've all declined. And some of them have declined to an extraordinary degree. Now, this post-World War II decline that I've been talking about isn't something which is really controversial in the research community. Not everybody reads this stuff, but I don't think anybody who has read the stuff really disagrees with it. But Professor Pinker is doing something very, very different. He's not talking about the period since the end of World War II. He's actually talking about a period that goes back to the beginning of recorded human history, 10,000 years at least. And this, he argues, there has been a decline in all forms of violence over these thousands of years, albeit with a great number of reverses on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's a process that has been extremely uneven. And he's been attacked, and primarily probably attacked from, on the one hand, grossly underestimating the violence of the 20th century, and then massively overestimating the violence in the earliest human societies. And part of the debate has crystallized over this question of whether or not World War II really was the bloodiest war in human history. And Pinker certainly agrees that more people were killed in this war than any other war in human history. But he says the critical thing that we need to understand is not how many people get killed, but how many people relative to the size of the population. That's what tells us about the deadliness of a particular war. And he argues that in fact, because the population of the world in the 1940s was so much larger than the population of the world in those earlier epochs, that this is something that needs to be taken into account, and very often it isn't. And indeed, he claims that when you adjust, or when you look at these battle deaths as a percentage of the world's population at a particular period in time, you'll find that World War II was only the 9th most deadly war in human history, and not the first. But this is a controversial metric. We discuss some of the controversies in the report. But I think the one point that we would really like to make here is that creating, if you like, league tables of the deadliest wars in history is interesting, but it leaves a huge gap. And the gap is what actually happens in the period between those very, very deadly wars. What happens? Why aren't we counting the wars that are somewhat less deadly? And when you do that, you get, I think, a very different picture, and one that actually confirms Pinker's basic thesis. Because he argues, or you can argue, and I think he probably does, that a more appropriate metric for measuring the deadliness of wars is violent deaths as a percentage of all deaths from all other causes. And when you use this particular metric, you'll find that the data from the early hunter-gatherer societies, much of it coming from archaeological sites, was about 15% of the estimated population at the time, which is huge. If you look at World War II, the bloodiest century in human history, according to many people, it's just 3%. And that 3% is already a very, very large sum. So I think that the evidence, even though you can disagree with which was the most deadly war, most deadly century, the evidence that Pinker produces, this latter evidence is actually much more persuasive than the former evidence. And the other thing is, of course, to remember that trends in violence aren't simply about war. War-caused deaths, in fact, only make up about 10% of the violent deaths that occur around the world. The other 90% are homicides. And what happens to homicides, or the homicide trend data, is obviously pretty critical for the Pinker thesis that all forms of violence have in fact declined. And here the empirical evidence that we have, going back from Europe into the 13th century, is pretty compelling that there have indeed been a centuries-long decline in national murder rates. If we can just see the graph over here, you can see this is a log scale graph. So if we're looking at the top left, we have Italy and the Netherlands, and here we have the homicides per 100,000 people per year in Italy and the Netherlands are almost 100. Huge. Today, if you look at Western Europe, the figure is somewhere between 1 and 2. So an extraordinary decline, and that's a decline I think which we see just about everywhere, which, as Pinker argues, the primary reason for that is that states begin to gain more and more effective control, and when they gain effective control over populations, that's when the levels of both criminal violence and feuding between groups begins to decline quite rapidly. We look at the developing world. The problem here is that the data is really, really bad. We don't have anything like the data that we have with respect to Western Europe. And in particular, the data that we have today, I think it's only something like 50% of countries regularly report to the United Nations, and the data that they report, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, is often extremely bad. And so how do you actually know what happened in the developing world over this very, very long period? And the answer is we don't. But what we do know is that there is some pretty reasonable data that's actually come from the earliest societies, and that shows a level of violence that was incomparably higher than the average level of violence we find around the world today, which is about 10 deaths per 100,000 of the population per year. And again, it's for the same basic reasons. And then there's a very interesting issue that's come up recently. Looking at Central America, a number of criminologists have been asking the question, saying, have these conflict researchers really understood what's going on here? Haven't they missed something? And they point out that the data from conventional wars may be shrinking, but the murder rate from drug wars has escalated dramatically in a number of parts of the world. If we can just look at this graph here, it's a pretty interesting one. What you see here, if you look at the red line, that's Mexico. And if you look at the left-hand axis, this is reported number of absolute deaths. And we're looking at the other three lines down there are Afghanistan, Sudan, and Iraq, which in 2011 were the countries that had the highest level of fatalities, wartime fatalities. And so you see that Mexico is almost twice as high as the deadliest war in the world in terms of the number of people killed by organized violence. Organized criminal violence, not organized political violence, but still pretty extraordinary. And then what is even more amazing, I think, in some ways, is that Mexico's homicide rate is actually relatively low compared with that of other Central American countries. Mexico's not really Central American. So Mexican homicide rate is 20 deaths per, it should be per 100,000 of the population, not per million. In Honduras, it's 90 per 100,000. El Salvador, 70 per 100,000. Guatemala, 40 per 100,000. Belize, 40 per 100,000 as well. So an extraordinarily high level, and raising a very interesting and obvious question. Maybe it's the case that wars are going down, but organized violence, criminalized violence, is going up. We aren't sure whether that's true or not. It's certainly not clear. Wars only kill 1/10 as many people as homicides, but only a relatively small percentage of the murders that are committed around the world are actually committed by organized criminal gangs. According to the UN, data's not that great, but maybe 15% in Asia, maybe 5% of all homicides in Europe are gang-related. In Latin America, you have the really high level. It's about 30% plus. Again, the figures are a little bit rubbery. But the interesting thing is, over the last 2 years, homicide rates related to gang violence in those Central American countries that I discussed briefly and in Mexico have all started coming down. They've actually come down quite considerably. So, what is the take-home message from this mass of trend data that have been created over the last couple of decades? We deal with this in considerable detail in the report itself, but just a couple of quick comments. Firstly, that many of the causes of these declining trends, and whether we're talking about changed attitudes to the resort of war, or the international community's ongoing commitment to peace-building programs, are durable. They're not going to go away. I remember about 3-4 years ago, there was a lot of concern in DPKO that we were suffering from peacekeeping fatigue, and that the amount of resources that were needed for peacekeeping and the amount of resources that were going to be going to peacekeeping were going to collapse. The interesting thing is that didn't actually happen. it appears to be the case that for whatever reason, the commitment to peace building, peacemaking in the UN and the international community is high, and it's likely to stay high. So we would argue that, and we spent a lot of time in the report talking about these, is that these